we're going to talk a little bit about different techniques to evaluate a board's effectiveness. So I'm very thrilled to introduce to everybody Denise Kuprionis. She is the founder of the Governance Solution Group. She has over 25 years experience inside the boardroom, that's public, private, and nonprofit boards. I've spoken to Denise a number of times. Most recently, we were together at the Society for Corporate Secretaries and Governance Annual Council, and I can attest to the fact that she offers a very independent perspective that really helps directors address the evolving list of board governance concerns. So Denise, welcome to our webinar today.
Thanks, Paul. It's good to be here.
So let's start our conversation with just a simple question. Is there, Denise, anything more important than the correct set of directors on a board?
Well, first I just wanted to say thanks to Passageways, to you, Paul, and Passageways for inviting me to participate in this conference, or in this webinar. I think it's a great opportunity for all of us, for all the participants. Thank you for participating, and I think hopefully we can all learn from each other. And I would encourage the participants to ask questions as we go along, so that we can hear not only from me but from others as well. So with that, getting back to your question, Paul, yes, I think that having the right people on the board is one of the most important things that the board must ensure, that they have the right people there. Maximizing the capacity of the board to add value while maintaining a critical and independent voice and skilled expert counsel is vital if the board is to fulfill its purpose of leading and ensuring company success. So board composition is very important. And also remember that company strategies shift, and so you have the board. You start out, okay, here's our board, but since company strategies shift, board composition must be revisited to affirm alignment between the support that a company's strategy requires and the director expertise and experience that's on the board. So I would say that an enlightened board really dives into company strategy so that they know what skills are needed to drive the business forward. This kind of board, they're always answering the question, who's on the board and do we have the right people there? So as I said, it's really important not only to look at who the board makeup is today, but important to know that even if you have the right board today, you might need a different board mix next year. So that's why it's so important to look at board composition annually.
So how would you do that? What is the technique or the process to do an annual review of your board?
Well, good question, Paul. And I think that meaningfully utilizing the skills matrix is one way to effectively analyze board composition and to link director talent back to strategy. I've found in my work with boards that the matrix is a really good visual tool for directors. It's a snapshot of current board makeup and skills, and because it's kind of a picture, it helps the board to see where there might be skill gaps.
So the skills matrix, would this be part of a board's annual performance review?
No, not really. I think it's there's the board performance review and the skills matrix are really two different tools. Now that said, certainly during a board evaluation, director talent, or as it might be, gaps in talent might come up. But I think the board's performance assessment looks at aggregate director talent, and the purpose of the board performance review is really to look at how the board works and how it might work better. So the performance assessment and the matrix are really two different tools. It helps, I guess, it's most helpful maybe to use the skills matrix, this exercise, immediately prior to the time that the nominating committee presents the annual nominee slate to the board for approval and presentation to shareholders. So it's kind of the skills, this tool, looking at the skills matrix, is what you kind of do, it's what the board looks at, so they understand fully the makeup as they're renominating or as they're looking at the, a director search. Does that mean? Good?
Yeah, interesting. So right here, for the audience, we have a slide showing what a skills matrix might look like. It's a template. And that would be customized to reflect the board's unique culture and strategy. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right, Paul. Most matrices, when identifying skills, will include kind of the obvious skills. So most boards, I can't think of a board that wouldn't have, financial expertise or operations expertise. But after that, the skills that your board's looking at is going to vary based on the business that the company is in and what skills would be most helpful both to the board and to the management team. So in this template that we're looking at right now, we would have directors' names written down the left-hand side, and the skills are shown along the top. Also along the top, it's helpful to note, the director's age, when they joined the board, and an expected retirement date, if that's known. This helps you get a clear picture of the aggregate board composition. Also, whether you mark it directly on the matrix, and on this sample we have up here, we don't have it on here, but it's also really important when you're looking at this big picture. You want to factor in such things as gender and ethnicity, geographic and economic diversity.
So this slide, just for our audience, may be a little bit difficult to read. After the webinar, we will be sending out an email to everyone, and there will be a link where you can download this in a usable format. So look for that email coming. So Denise, kind of related to the skills matrix, I'd like to chat a little bit now about self-assessment tools. You and I have spoken about those before. You've had years of experience working with and counseling boards. Could you talk about the different types of assessments that are out there for directors?
Sure, Paul. But first, let's kind of get the elephant out of the room and face the fact that nobody likes evaluations, most of all directors. So I just kind of deal with that up front when I start talking with clients about the board assessment, because there's always a few, whether it's on the management team or whether it's on the board, that are saying, oh, what is this? We don't really want to be evaluated. And nobody really likes it, but I think, as employees and then the boards come to understand too that it really is a helpful development tool. So I believe that most boards, there's a few exceptions, but most boards are made up of really smart people who want the best for the company. So if that's true, why do you really need evaluations? And the answer is clear to me, and I think to really good boards. It's because the best boards want to get even better, and this tool is something that helps them do just that. When we talk about evaluations, there's really maybe 5 types of evaluations out there. So the first is kind of the full board performance assessment, and that's what's required. If you're a New York Stock Exchange company, you're required to do a full board performance assessment. There's also NASDAQ doesn't. If you're traded there, they're not. They don't require the board. You don't have to check a box saying you're doing the board performance evaluation, but it's strongly encouraged. And if you're not traded on those exchanges, but rather maybe a private company, We're finding that many private companies are, it's just a really good practice. I'm not a believer in I really don't like the term best practice, because it has to be a best practice for your company, and what might be a best practice for another company may not be the best practice for your company, or it may need some modification. But this would be one example. This annual board performance, this opportunity for the board to look at how it works, is something that's really good, I think, for every board to do, whether it's public or private. So anyway, so there's we talked about the full board performance, it's the requirement. There's the director self-assessment, which is really a little more just what it says, where directors are kind of self-assessing their own performance. There's the director peer review, where directors are assessing the performance of one another. And there's committee assessments, and then there's kind of the board relations assessment, really into kind of the board and management and how they work together kind of assessment. And that's often not considered a separate assessment, but often is part of the full board performance assessment. So I think today so those are that's kind of the overview. I think today what we really wanted to focus on was the director self-assessment. So sometimes the boards use this director self-assessment is used to, I'd say, build up maybe to the full board performance review. So if you're not required to do the full board performance review, some boards choose to start with this kind of director self-assessment. So this is when directors look internally and ask themselves questions about how they're doing. And then there's often a facilitated conversation that talks a little more about board operations, and often topics will come up that were in those director self-assessments. So the director self-assessment is usually not shared with one another, so it's something that people do individually. Directors can take kind of a survey. It can be an online, it can be on paper, it can be sent in advance. So a board might say, well, we're going to do this, the self-assessments, and they may send out a questionnaire ahead of time for directors to answer questions, not turn it in, but just so that they know what the topic. There's an agenda item on that board meeting says, we're going to have a conversation, and so directors look at it. And sometimes, if it's not sent out ahead of time, what I've seen boards do is they'll, like right before a break at the board meeting, they'll hand this out, the questionnaires out, and have directors will have 10 minutes or the break period or whatever to kind of go through the questions in their own mind, and then just have a facilitated conversation then about that.
So who would you recommend, or in your experience, facilitates this kind of review or this conversation?
I think that often when companies are just starting out with the board evaluation process, the conversation is usually facilitated by the board chair. And then as I mentioned earlier, this individual self-assessment is kind of something that kind of the first step in doing a full board performance assessment. So as the board gets a little more comfortable with the self-assessment, then they move into kind of the full board performance assessment, and then they start to think about having an independent person come in and help with the assessment. And people use independent folks for there's certainly really good reasons to have an internal person facilitate the conversations and to facilitate the whole process. I mean, if you have your board chair or your lead director, they know the company, they know the board, so there's really good reasons to do that. There's also good reasons to bring in a third party, somebody that's bringing a different perspective to the conversation. So it's kind of we all get used to doing things the same old way, and it all feels good. But then when you have somebody ask a question about, well, why do you do it this way? It kind of makes you think about that. So that's why I think definitely seeing an uptick in directors using independent folks to come in and help with that. And also, I would say, looking at the people, there's people kind of, if you look at it, think of it kind of as a continuum, where you start with the self-assessment and then move into the full board assessment, and then as you got comfortable with the self-assessment, you move in with the full board assessment, and as you're comfortable with that, directors, boards are moving into the peer-to-peer assessment. So I wouldn't say that the peer-to-peer is really popular yet, but it's absolutely growing, and more folks are doing that. There's a lot of reasons. I think all the increased disclosure that we're starting to see about boards and how they do this, I think that's some of the reasons for doing that.
So Denise, we actually have two questions. I'm going to bring them both up now. So the first is, it's an interesting question. So why wouldn't a self-assessment be shared? Wouldn't that be for the betterment of the board?
Yeah. Well, I'm answering it two ways. So one, the reason the self-assessments normally aren't shared, so two things can happen. One, they're not shared with anybody. And it's because it's really an internal look. And directors, if you're just starting to do this, directors are a little nervous about kind of going back to the why are we doing the board evaluation kind of thing, and I don't want to be tested kind of thing. So this is having the self-assessment without that sharing of all of my answers is one way to get directors used to it. It's also, if directors really look through the questions, it's a way to make them think, oh, how am I really doing? Because most people don't often, if you serve on a board or pick a committee or something, you don't often step back and say, how am I doing on this? So there is some value to that, even if it's not shared. Now, another thing that people do with the self-assessment is have them self-assess, and then they can turn in that self-assessment to a lead director or to an independent person, and have them kind of sort through and come out with some themes, and then share those in a facilitated board discussion. So that's another way that it's done.
Okay. I think I'm going to save the other question for the end, because I think it might spur some great conversation. It's a good question, so we'll talk about that one. So let's get a little more specific and talk about how to create the self-assessment tool. What kind of questions have you seen directors ask of themselves?
Well, I've listed on this slide 10 sample questions, and you can see they're all kind of the I questions. So I attend every board meeting and committee meeting where I'm a member. I insist on having sufficient information and due process for every board decision. So these are kind of the I questions. Keep in mind that so these are some sample questions that you might have, but it's also really important to when you're figuring out what are the questions that I should share with my board and what we should be asking. It's you don't want to just like I said, I think these are good questions, but you also want to make sure that the questions fit your company culture. And so you'll want to, some of the questions, well, these are kind of good questions to ask anybody. You'll also want to, include questions that are a little more specific to your company. Oftentimes the questions are divided into, you might have a section on kind of personal participation, and then you might have a section on kind of the logistics, do we have enough meetings and things like that. kind of moves them a little more into kind of the full board performance without saying we're doing the full board performance evaluation yet, but it really helps kind of spur that that conversation.
Okay, I've got two questions. So the first is, are there any key questions that you would recommend always be asked that you've either seen or through your experience?
That's a good question, and I'm just thinking that when I look, and I think we'll talk about this in a little bit, and I think that it'll maybe talk a little bit more, but I mean, sorry, I'm stumbling for just a second, but key questions, it really gets down to, you know, the things that I look for in a board is, you know, or things that I want to discover when I'm working with a board is, you know, to find out, you know, is there a culture of trust and respect and accountability in this boardroom? So, I mean, that's something I really, you know, that I want to find out. And, you know, questions, I guess, let me answer the question a different way. That, you know, a board has a couple of major responsibilities. One is to monitor, you know, that you got strategy, and to monitor the CEO and evaluate the CEO. So I think, you know, two really good questions that probably should always be on there. One would relate to, you know, what's the board's, in how much does this, and a question that somehow relates to how is the board's, is the board involved in the strategy of the company going forward, or does the board, depending on your culture and how the strategy is developed, but, you know, does the board know what that strategy is? I would want to say, does the board know what's keeping the CEO up at night? I would want to ask if the board has a is effectively monitoring the CEO. Is the board discussing compensation and rewarding performance or not? And is there, you know, the emergency succession planning, those kinds of things. So those I would always want to ask about. You think, does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you very much. Here's a related question. So during the self-assessment, if a director identifies gaps, what's the best way for them to fill those gaps? And I can understand the question. Is this something they go to the chair and say, well, you know, at the end of the day, I'm not sure that I do understand our CEO's most critical challenges, right? How would you recommend a director, you know, because this is somewhat private, how do they go about filling the gaps they've identified?
So I'm going to answer, so you asked kind of two questions. So the first one, if in the self-assessment the director says, you know, I think we really do have, you know, gaps, like you know, something that might come up, we don't have anybody on the board that knows anything about technology or that knows anything about cybersecurity, or, you know, nothing that, and whether or not you need someone with that knowledge is, you know, that's a different question. But let's just say that a director says, you know, we don't have anybody on here, so how do we do that? So the way that I would hope that once everybody asks has answered these self-assessment questions, you're going to have this conversation, and who's ever facilitating, you know, might say, you know, one of the questions that we talked about was, you know, just looking at the slide here, the 8th question was, you know, we asked about it, you know, I believe our board has the skills and diversity it needs to do its work. How did you all answer that question? You know, so I think it's really important for that facilitator to get to that question, and for the whole board to have a conversation. So the first step is for each director themselves to kind of answer that, at least in this way we're talking about, this self-assessment tool. Each director is asking themselves that question, right? And some directors may say, no gaps, we're great. Some may say we have some gaps when they're thinking this through their own mind, whether they're writing it down or not. And then when you're facilitating that conversation, that might be you know, one of the questions that the facilitator really says, you know, so how did everybody answer that question? You know, so you're not making someone answer, but I would hope that the board has enough trust among itself that they will say, you know, I was just wondering, do we have technology experience? Is enough technology experience on this board? You know, or is that a gap? What do we think? You know, are we getting that expertise somewhere else? And to have the board have a full conversation about that. And then, I'm sorry, Paul, I started to write down and I forgot. You asked, there was another question about, there was the gaps, and then there was another question I was going to address too, a little bit in a different way.
Well, I think I had just said, you know, I think you did address it in what you said.
Okay.
This was around, you know, how do you ask for that assistance, you know, in that kind of environment? I think you just kind of went through that. We did get a quick follow-up on the self-assessment, which I think is a good question. So, you know, when you look at one of the assessment items, such as I constructively challenge management's and other directors' strategies so the board reaches the best possible decisions, is there value in giving an example of what some of this means? For example, is every director going to look at constructively challenge the same way? So, you know, would examples within the questions asked in the tool be beneficial?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think certainly people, everybody, and maybe not everybody, but certainly there are people who could interpret what constructively challenge management means. That would, you know, that is, you know, is definitely subject to some interpretation. And some people would say yes because they ask one question a quarter, and you know, whatever. So there could be variances there. But that, again, I think what that gets to is the importance of having a board discussion after the self-assessment. So there are two ways. I keep talking about the conversation that the full board has after this, because I think that is of utmost importance. But another way to do it, if the conversation, you know, if there's not a real robust conversation, that you would encourage directors that if they answer this, you know, I really don't understand our CEO's most critical challenges, for example, and they answer that negatively, but it never really came up in the board discussion, or it wasn't really a fulsome discussion. Whoever is facilitating this, or particularly the board chair or the lead director, to say, you know, if there's a question, if there's something you're not sure about on one of these, or you had an answer that, you know, maybe you don't think is the quote-unquote right answer, please call me and let's have a one-on-one conversation about that. So I think it's important for that, like I said, for that board chair to kind of do that intro to the conversation. Says, you know, if there's something you're not comfortable with, or an answer, a question that you're not sure about, you know, please let's have a one-on-one conversation about it. So that's how I would go about getting to that.
Okay. One last question on self-assessment. In your experience, how do public boards conduct an assessment in an open session that might be subject to sunshine laws, and maybe even have members of the media present?
Oh, great question. I worked with a board that was subject to sunshine laws, and the way the and this depends, I think, a little bit on how your state, what the state's sunshine laws particularly say. So you'd want to talk, you know, and make sure that, you know, with the council there. But the way I did it when I worked with a board that was subject to that, we did the self-assessment by having, I had individual interviews with each member, so that wasn't subject to the sunshine laws. So we did the interviews, or you could do a survey. But in this case, I did interviews. And then we had a conversation with, I had a conversation with the, I think it was the governance committee, and it wasn't, how did we do that? It wasn't I think it was the full governance committee, and in this case, that was okay. It didn't have to be back with, I mean, that wasn't, because it wasn't the full board, they were allowed to have that conversation with me, just that committee. So I think you do have to check and see what your laws are. In that case, Actually, in that case, I did have the conversation with the governance committee. I was confused there, but my first conversation, they had the sunshine laws, but I was allowed to have a conversation. The full board was invited to the first meeting we had. I always have afterwards, I kind of have a debrief meeting, so it's kind of we have the conversation and then we had a debrief meeting, and my debrief meeting was with just the governance committee. And I had meetings with just the chair of the board and the chair of the governance committee up front. And then we had individual interviews. And like I said, I know all of their board meetings were subject to, Sunshine. They had media there, but they were allowed to have some meetings. And I think, if I'm recalling, maybe it was in how it was defined, what they were talking about, but it worked. So I think it's just a matter of looking at what the laws really are. I know I wasn't real clear on that, but I hope it was helpful. They did have sunshine laws, and they were subject to it, and the media and anybody that wanted to come could come to their regular board meetings, but they were allowed to have some meetings separate.
Okay, no, thank you. I think what we're going to do now is move on to our last subject, which is evaluating a board's effectiveness. Denise, how do you know if you have an effective board?
Well, as I kind of implied before, Paul, I wish there was a magic answer, but it's really a combination of things. I mean, it's easy if you flip the question and say, how do we know if we don't have an effective board, right? Because we're reading about those boards in the paper, and it's because there's been some whether insider trading or there's been some interrelated party transaction or something's come out and it's been bad news. But on the how do you know if the board is effective? I don't think that there is a single measurement. I think it is it's an aggregate, and like I said, I started to say in with one of the other questions, and what I try to show in this slide, it's this it's a combination. So you really have to look at how the company's doing, right? What are the company metrics? You really have to look at your board. Are they attending the meetings? Is there this board culture? I think is so important. This trust, respect, and accountability, and that is hard to really get to. But when you have individual, I think that's a hard thing to get to in surveys. Much easier to get to in individual interviews, but probably one of the most important things. And in some cases, to get to that, boards will have a independent observer in a meeting. So I have in some cases, as we get ready to work with them on a particular issue, just observe a meeting, which is really pretty telling. Then other things that that I like to learn in working with a board and helping them to evaluate their effectiveness and what they can do better. And keep in mind, this isn't about what's wrong with the board. This is always about, maybe in one or two cases, most of the time though, this is just about how the board's going to get better, how they get better at getting better. So you want to look at this combination of things. You want to know, like I said, if I'm working with a board, I want to discover, has the board engaged a really top CEO? Does the board have this emergency and and a natural CEO succession plan in place? How is the meeting attendance? Are the directors easy to get a hold of? So if the corporate secretary or the general counsel or the CEO needs to get a hold of them, do they all respond quickly? Do they respond very timely? And again, how is the company's performance? If you have strategic goals, are they meeting them? And what kind of comments are you hearing from, if it's a traded company, from investors and shareholders, or even if it's not traded, you have most companies have some investors, and however you define those investors, and what are you hearing from those folks? So it's I wish there was one easy answer for is my board effective? But I think it's really a combination of things that you have to look at. One of those things being, does the board ever stop and really look at how it does its work? And that's part of what the performance evaluation is all about. And then the slide you just put up, Paul, this is, I think, a helpful talking about board effectiveness. This is really kind of getting down to meeting effectiveness, which a combination of meetings could relate to how the board's effectiveness. And so these are 4 questions that I think are helpful for a board to ask after each meeting. So you might have the board chair at the end of the meeting, just say, did we accomplish what we needed to get done today? And just kind of go around the room and ask that question. What could we have done better? Did we have the right materials in advance? And just as important, what key terms should, or key items should be on the next meeting agenda? So right there, while you have all the board, before everybody is, gone gone on to their next thing, just ask them. So I think that asking these kind of questions, even though this is directly about meeting effectiveness, I think it helps to, if you ask these after each meeting, kind of the combination of answers, kind of your aggregate, will also help give you a metric for board effectiveness.
Thank you, Denise. This has been a great conversation, so I appreciate your time. I think what we're going to do now is we're going to wrap up with a couple questions that we've received. So here's the first. Can you speak a bit more to diversity in a board's composition? You mentioned a little bit about some of the kind of information to collect around each board member, but this individual said that they've always felt that the diversity of their board should match the diversity of their customers. Do you agree, or would you look for other factors?
Absolutely, I agree. I think that it's, when I look at diversity of the board, I want to know that one of the first questions that you ask is, does the board have, the skills and knowledge it needs, and are there members who have a customer and an employee frame of reference? So that's kind of my the question that I ask when I'm doing the skills matrix. Because as that the participant that asked the question said, having that customer reference is important. So when I talk about diversity, I mean, the first thing that, just because of what you see in the news today, the first thing you kind of think about is gender. And that's important, but it's not the only thing to look at when you're looking at diversity. It's, it's clearly, it's about tenure. How long have people been on the board? And I'm not a believer in age that you say, oh, at 60 or 72 people should get off the board. I don't think that's because you could have that might be the person that's 72 may be the best participant on your board. If they're not, they shouldn't be there, but they may be the best one. So I don't like those hard rules. Or you have to retire at at 65, or you can only serve for 10 years or something like that. But I do think you need to look at, do we have some people that have only been on the board for a couple of years and some people that have been on for a long time? I think it's that combination is really important. I mean, gender is important. I think ethnicity is important. But then you also have to look at geographic. Now, geographic may be important to your company or may not be, depending on what it is. But oftentimes, it's good to have somebody that's not just your neighbor that's on your board, to get some, broader spectrum of opinions. And I think, I refer to it as economic status. But what I mean by that is, if your company is, I should have a good example off the top of my mind, but if it's a community, a store, smaller store, not one of your big retailers or big box kind of retailers, and if that's what they're really doing, and if all you had on your board were these billionaire people, they might, and that they don't shop at that store, I think that's could be an issue. So I think it's might not be the greatest example, but I think it's important that you have some diversity there too. So when I talk about diversity on the board and looking at the skills matrix, it's kind of that aggregate, and I want to hear a little bit, see a little. I don't want everybody to be like everybody else. Does that answer your question?
It does, and actually kind of related to that, a little commercial for an upcoming Passageways webinar. We're going to be talking about Gen X entering the boardroom, right, which is kind of related to the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
We had a previous question that I was going to hold, but I think you just addressed it. It was around term limits for board members, right? And the comment was, we're talking about making sure you do assessments and evaluations and you get the right composition and you get all the way there, and now you got a term limit and you lose, right, that resource that you had. And I think you just kind of said you're not necessarily in favor of term limits, but can you speak just maybe another couple sentences around your feeling of term limits and its impact on boards?
Yeah, I think, like I said, term limits, that's a hard limit. And, there's a lot of press out there these days about term limits. And like I said, I'm not a believer in that hard limit, because I think that it's, you may have somebody that's been on the board for 20 years and maybe they're great, and you may have somebody on the board that's been there for 2 years and they're lousy. But if you had a hard term limit, the one that's great might have to leave the board, and the one that's not so great would still be on the board. That's why I don't like that hard line. But what I do think, some boards need that hard line, and they use it. They think, Jonesy here isn't such a great board member. He misses meetings, but you know what? He's going to be off next year, so let's just let it go. And so some boards need that discipline, and I don't. And that's a whole different question. But my feeling is, if you really get down to doing, no matter how you do it, an effective director performance and board performance, if you're nominating and governance committee prior to that election process, you really do a fulsome evaluation. Then then I think you don't need those hard term limits. And also, we hear a lot these days about board refreshment, and part of that, when you hear it, is about bringing new people on, kind of refreshing the board in that way. But there are other ways to refresh your board, and it's about board education. And what is board education? How does your board get information, and do they ever attend webinars like we're doing this one? Do we give them information about good governance? What kind of education, do we have speakers come in prior to the board meeting? Do they talk to, do we ever have, somebody with expertise in whether it's compensation or whatever might be appropriate for your company? Do we have periodically have an agenda item on the board where directors can, get updated on some things, not just from the management team, so we kind of get past that asymmetrical information comment. So I think that there are a lot of ways to, if you do all of those things, if you do the effective board education, and you do, refresh the board in those ways, and you do the performance evaluation, and you look at the whole board has a discussion about each year about how it does its work. If you do all of those things in a good way, I don't think you need to have worry as much about the tenure and those hard limits.
Okay. We are basically out of time, but I got two additional questions that I'd like a quick comment if I could get from you, Denise, because I think
Okay.
they're good. So the first one is, how do you get your board in the correct frame of mind for a self-assessment or any kind of evaluation, right? I mean, they probably, some may take it as a threat, take things personally. How do you foster a feeling of positivity for that kind of evaluation or assessment?
Yeah, yeah, very good question. And the way I've seen, I can speak from my own experience when I was in-house, and this is the same experience that I know other people have done. So I started sharing information with my board about kind of generally, just about, just a short little one-pager on good governance practices, right? So, not necessarily best practice, but some good practices that people were really starting to do, and things that might be helpful. And then I would say, here's what I'm starting to read about, XYZ, board evaluations. And then, I would add as a paragraph, short paragraph, about, why it might be effective for or helpful for our board to do this, and here's how we might do it, just in real short, little way to do it. And then there'd be a couple other things on this sheet. So I was kind of just giving them information about what good boards were doing. Not coming with a formal recommendation about doing it, but just kind of giving them some information, some food for thought. And then I would start seeing if we could put it on the governance committee agenda for them to talk about, and have a conversation. And then eventually one of the directors, what I found, will finally say, you know what, that is a really pretty good idea. We really should look. We evaluate the CEO every year, and the CEO evaluates his or her direct reports. Don't you think that maybe we could learn something about how we operate if we did a board evaluation? And I would just emphasize, I can't say enough, that it is not about what's wrong. It's about, how could we do things better? Sometimes I give, we should use the example of, I can think in my own life, personal life and business life, where, gosh, I always do the same thing and I do it this way. And I know that there might be some other ways to do it, but you know what? It works. It's not broken. Why should I take the time? It's going to take a lot of time if I change it. But you know what? If you want to improve and get better, and this is what it's about. It's about the company, for the benefit of your shareholders and your owners. It's about the company getting better. And the board is at the top. Everybody should be looking to the board. How do they do things? So if the board evaluates its performance, it's kind of okay for everybody else to do it too. Why wouldn't they? Everybody else is. So it's a bunch of, you get your board used to it by, like I said, emphasizing that it's not about, what's wrong. This is just about looking at how we're doing things, and you accept that if I start talking about it with my board today, they're probably not going to do it tomorrow, but maybe next quarter or maybe next year. But it's a gradual process. But in today's world, it's pretty hard to imagine. I mean, you're reading boards are. I used to talk about a continuum for doing the board evaluation, that, boards started out saying, we don't need to do this, we're good, we're good, everybody's good. And then it just, well, you know what, maybe we could learn something from this. And I would say that many boards are on the other end of the continuum, and they're starting to see some benefit from doing this in a meaningful way.
Okay, thank you. Very, very last question. Who would you recommend typically creates, who would you recommend, or do you see typically create questions for a director self-assessment? What are the roles that would do that?
Who creates it?
Yeah,
If you're, yeah, I mean, I think that the question is answered by, it's usually if you have a a draft is, it's usually kind of starts the governance committee. If you have a governance committee, that's kind of where it starts. Could start with the full board, and whoever is the kind of the main liaison, the main person that works with the board. That person could be the corporate secretary, a chief governance officer, a legal counsel, whoever is the person, the senior management person, might even be the CFO in a smaller company, whoever is really working with that board. Once the board has said, yeah, I'd kind of like to do that, they'll kind of put together some draft questions, and then the board will kind of, like I said, usually I see it kind of as the governance committee, or it could be, depending on the size of your board, the size of your company, it might just be that board chair that sits back. Actually, I worked with a company who was really just the board chair that sat back and said, here's what I think we should do, and kind of put the questions together for that company.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for attending, and I definitely want to thank Denise Kuprionis for being part of this discussion. It was very interesting. I'm sure everybody carried away a lot of information. We had a lot of good dialogue. You can see Denise's information, contact information there. Clearly, she's very knowledgeable and an expert in her field. Please reach out to her if you have any needs for your board. I do want to let everyone know that we will be sending out an email with copies of the slides, also a replay of the webinar, and then also the skills assessment that Denise has created. Thank you again for attending the Passageways webinar, and we look forward to speaking with you next time.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. I enjoyed being with you all.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.